The night the news broke, the world was focused on America's shrinking harvests, collapsing export deals, and a trade war that had already burned through 2 growing seasons. Yet, thousands of miles away, on the dry plains of Burkina Faso, a different kind of story was beginning, one that would shake the foundations of Western agricultural power. The question emerged almost instantly. How could a seed law worth $900 million cause this much alarm in Washington? The answer begins with 2 farmers who will never meet. In Iowa, a 63-year-old corn grower locked the door of his barn for the last time. He had survived drought, storms, and fluctuating fuel costs, but he could not survive a world where foreign tariffs crushed American exports. At the same moment, in Koudougou, a Burkinabe farmer leaned over a small clay bowl containing the seeds his grandmother saved before she passed. He whispered a word the West had forgotten: belonging. It was in this emotional contrast, collapse in one world, rebirth in another, that Burkina Faso introduced the most defiant agricultural law Africa has seen in decades, a $900 million Anti-GMO Seed Law, designed to phase out Monsanto-linked strains, restore indigenous crops, and rebuild Africa's food sovereignty from the soil upward. If this story matters for Africa, press like so this message reaches more people. The law did not appear in isolation. It rose from a continental determination to reclaim seed autonomy after years of dependency on patented biotechnology. For many in the Sahel, GMO seeds symbolized a deeper truth, a quiet form of control that dictated what could grow, when it could be planted, and who ultimately profited. With this law, Burkina Faso delivered a message powerful enough to pierce the silence. Africa would no longer rent its future from foreign labs. Inside American policy circles, the reaction was immediate and tense. Advisors warned that if Africa pivoted to indigenous agriculture, the U.S. would lose one of its last stable markets for genetically engineered crops. Investors asked what would happen if Mali, Niger, or Ghana followed Burkina's example. But while Washington worried about market share, Africans were asking a different question. What does it mean to finally grow food that answers only to the land and not to a corporation? As debates intensified, one fear echoed across the West. If Africa rises agriculturally, who loses control? And that leads us to the next turning point. How exactly did this $900 million law threaten the most powerful GMO empire in the world? What happened next was not simply the passage of a law. It was the opening shot of a new agricultural era. Burkina Faso's $900 million Anti-GMO Seed Law emerged from months of scientific reviews, soil studies, and village consultations. Yet when it reached the National Assembly, the vote lasted barely an hour. Lawmakers knew exactly what they were doing, ending a 20-year cycle in which patented GMO seeds had crept deeper into African farmland, shaping harvests, dictating fertilizer use, and tying farmers to annual seed purchases controlled by foreign corporations. The new law banned 4 major GMO strains linked to Monsanto and Bayer, tightened border inspections, required full genetic transparency for every foreign crop, and allocated nearly $1 billion to reviving indigenous seed banks across the Sahel. But behind the technical language, the law expressed a far more profound message: that Africa was ready to reclaim the biological foundation of its food system. In Wahiguya, farmers gathered around radio sets as the announcement went live. Some clapped, some cried quietly, remembering seasons when GMO cotton promised higher yields, but instead delivered soil exhaustion and debt. One elder said, "We lost the taste of our own land." Others spoke of family seeds once carried across generations but now nearly forgotten. The law felt like a return of memory, a restoration of something older than the modern state itself. In Washington, however, the reaction was abrupt and deeply political. Analysts in the U.S. Department of Agriculture warned that losing African markets would strike at the heart of America's agricultural export strategy. After years of trade war damage,
farmers in the Midwest depended on overseas buyers more than ever. A classified briefing circulated among congressional offices stated, "If Africa abandons biotech dependence, the United States faces a long-term strategic agricultural disadvantage." One senator asked a question that captured the tension. What if this becomes a regional movement? The fear was real, because the $900 million law was not designed in isolation.
It was part of a broader African trend toward food independence, local rice projects in Senegal, indigenous cocoa frameworks in Ghana, community seed vaults in Mali. Western officials worried that Traoré, with his rising influence in the Sahel, could use the law as a blueprint for a continental agricultural bloc that Washington could no longer shape. Meanwhile, European voices entered the debate. Agricultural lobbies in Brussels demanded a WTO review, arguing that the law unfairly excludes EU-certified biotech products. French media called the move a break from the global agricultural system. But Africans heard these criticisms as echoes of an older pattern: decisions about Africa made outside Africa. And inside Burkina itself, the story took a human turn. In a small training center near Bobo Dioulasso, young biologists worked on reviving a millet species once grown by their great-grandmothers. They mixed soil samples, reviewed moisture maps, and whispered proudly that this seed, not imported GMO hybrids, might feed the country for a century. One researcher said, "We are not against science. We are against dependence." That sentence captured the soul of the $900 million law more than any official speech could. Yet while Africa moved toward autonomy, the economic reality in the United States sharpened the contrast. Drought hit parts of Kansas. Soybean exports fell by double digits. The trade war continued to rattle markets. American farmers protested outside state capitals, demanding relief packages. In that moment, the symbolism became unavoidable. America, the world's agricultural power, was struggling, while Africa, long dismissed as dependent, was rising through self-directed reform. But even as citizens celebrated, one question remained beneath the surface. Would global powers allow Africa to restructure the agricultural map? As discussions intensified, whispers began circulating about a possible countermove from Western corporations and allied governments. Could pressure be applied through aid programs? Could restrictions be added to trade agreements? Could WTO investigations escalate into formal disputes? Uncertainty hung in the air. Still, inside Burkina Faso, the mood remained steady. Farmers repeated a proverb that spread quickly across the Sahel. A land remembers the hands that plant it. And with that, they prepared for the next planting season, one defined not by foreign patents, but by seeds that carried their own names and stories. If truth is a compass, set your bearing in the comments. What happens when Africa claims not just its gold, its borders, or its energy, but its seeds? The answer would shape the next act of this unfolding confrontation. The confrontation reached its breaking point the moment Western institutions realized the $900 million Anti-GMO Seed Law was not simply agricultural policy. It was a geopolitical message. Within 48 hours of the vote, Washington convened an emergency roundtable with biotech executives, trade lawyers, and national security advisors. A memo circulated internally warned that Burkina Faso's action could trigger a systemic collapse of GMO market penetration in West Africa. The phrase that caught everyone's attention was even starker. If Traoré succeeds, control mechanisms erode. Across the Atlantic, the European Commission called for an urgent assessment on trade distortions. French agricultural lobbies, long dependent on African markets, pressed Paris to defend European biotech influence. European commentators framed the law as a strategic rupture, while some American analysts openly described it as the first agricultural rebellion of the Global South. But as accusations, fears, and warnings multiplied in Western media, Africa responded with remarkable calm. In Ouagadougou, Traoré delivered a short public address without raising his voice. He stood before a simple wooden podium and said, "A nation that cannot control its seed cannot control its destiny." There were no theatrics, no cameras zooming in for effect, only a quiet certainty. That tone, more than the words themselves, unsettled many observers abroad. In Bamako, agronomists from Mali's National Research Institute gathered for a late-night meeting. They studied Burkina's legal provisions line by line, analyzing how a similar framework might reinforce their own seed sovereignty goals. In Niamey, Niger's transitional governments held consultations with civil leaders, asking whether the Sahel should form a regional seed council to standardize indigenous crop protection. The idea that Africa could write its own agricultural rules and enforce them sent waves through foreign ministries in the West. Meanwhile, in rural Burkina Faso, the reaction was not political, but personal. Families gathered around fires in the cool Sahel evening, recounting stories of the seeds their ancestors once cultivated. Women described how certain sorghum varieties survived droughts long before imported hybrids arrived. Elders explained why millet was considered sacred, not because of myth, but because of memory. The law felt less like a reform and more like a return to something essential. "This is not resistance," one village teacher said. "This is repair." Yet the moment of true climax came when global biotech corporations stepped forward. 3 major firms, acting independently but with aligned concerns, issued coordinated statements warning that Burkina's law could create unpredictable market instability. Behind closed doors, however, their language was sharper. They feared losing patents, influence, and the leverage that came with control of seed supply chains. A leaked report suggested some companies were exploring options through the WTO dispute mechanism. The very idea of dragging a small African nation before an international tribunal over its choice of seed ignited outrage across the Sahel. In response, Africa did not shout. It organized. Young agricultural engineers launched online campaigns demonstrating the viability of indigenous seed varieties. Universities released soil studies proving the resilience of pre-colonial crops. Farmers recorded short videos showing fields planted without imported seed stock. The message was unmistakable. Africa was not simply resisting, it was building. In the United States, however, the situation grew more tense. As droughts intensified across parts of the Midwest, farmers wondered aloud why billions were being poured into trade wars, while Africa advanced without dependency. A retired wheat farmer in Nebraska told a local radio station, "Maybe they're doing what we should have done years ago. Protect your soil. Protect your seed." His comment spread quickly on social media, contrasting sharply with the official narrative in Washington. Still, American analysts remained focused on one man, Ibrahim Traore. Think tank discussions increasingly framed him as the architect of post-GMO Africa. Some warned that his influence could reshape alliances and markets, especially if he helped neighboring countries form a unified agricultural bloc. One U.S. policy strategist said, "If Africa moves together, we lose the ability to negotiate piece by piece. The balance shifts." Inside Burkina Faso, people understood that power had finally begun to tilt. The law was not a weapon. It was a foundation. It signaled that Africa was no longer waiting for permission to define its agricultural future. If this moment struck a chord with you, steady the lantern, mark the time in your mind, and share the thought it lit. Because the next question is the one Western capitals fear most. What happens when a nation that has reclaimed its seeds begins reclaiming everything else? What unfolded inside Burkina Faso after the $900 million Anti-GMO Seed Law was not a simple policy transition. It was a social awakening. For the first time in a generation, villages, towns, scientists, and farmers felt aligned around a single idea: that sovereignty begins in the soil. The law triggered a chain of consequences that reached far beyond agriculture and reshaped the civic landscape of the country. In the rural north, families who once depended on imported seed packets now began gathering in community circles to exchange ancestral varieties. These were not symbolic gestures. These meetings revived entire local economies. Seed keepers, once unrecognized, suddenly became cultural guardians. Women who managed seed preservation for decades found themselves at the center of national conversation. School teachers introduced new lessons on indigenous crops, explaining to children why a seed that has lived on Burkinabe soil for centuries carries more than genetic value. It carries identity. In the marketplaces of Kaya and Dedugu, traders spoke proudly about the return of real millet, real sorghum, and real cotton, as if reuniting with old friends. The psychological effect was unmistakable. People began believing that the country could feed itself, not through miracle technologies, but through patient renewal. This optimism, however, did not blind them to the risks. Everyone knew that economic retaliation was possible, even likely. When rumors spread that certain Western buyers were reconsidering contracts for Burkina's cotton and sesame, the reaction was not fear, it was resolve. Citizens remembered how dependency had turned seasons into gambles. Now, they were prepared to endure short-term difficulties for long-term autonomy. One farmer said during a community meeting, "We have lived through worse storms. This time, at least, we plant our own future." Politically, the law created an unexpected stabilizing effect. Young activists who once debated ideology now debated irrigation techniques, drought resistance, and crop diversification. Civil society groups, long fractured by competing priorities, found common purpose in defending the seed law. Even opposition leaders admitted publicly that the shift toward local crops was a unifying national interest. In Ouagadougou, the National Assembly received a surge of proposals for complementary reforms. Soil restoration programs, water retention strategies, local fertilizer production, and a Sahel-wide seed cooperation pact. What began as a single law was turning into a blueprint for national redesign. Yet the most profound consequence was how the law redefined Burkina's place within Africa. Regional governments quietly sent delegations to study the law. Mali expressed interest in creating a shared Sahel seed bank. Niger proposed a cross-border indigenous crop corridor. Ghana and Senegal initiated consultations with local farmers to measure public support for similar legislation. It became clear that Burkina Faso was no longer simply reacting to world events. It was shaping them. But international shifts are never simple. As more African nations explored seed sovereignty policies, Western institutions interpreted the trend as a direct challenge. Experts in Washington warned that Africa's collective agricultural autonomy would weaken Western leverage in trade negotiations, climate agreements, and development programs. A former trade advisor told a think tank panel, "Once Africa secures its food base, our bargaining position collapses." Meanwhile, in Brussels, concerns grew that indigenous seed laws would disrupt Europe's carefully built export relationships. French media highlighted fears that Africa's agricultural emancipation could undermine European biotech interests. These reactions only deepened Africa's determination. In the streets of Ouagadougou, murals appeared depicting a seed breaking free from chains. Youth groups adopted slogans like, "Our future, our soil." Religious leaders preached about stewardship of land and responsibility to future generations. At national ceremonies, elders blessed jars of indigenous seed as symbols of continuity. Through all of this, one question quietly rose in the minds of citizens. Would external powers attempt to pressure Burkina Faso into modifying or reversing the law? The fear was not unfounded, but neither was the confidence. People believed that Traoré would not bend easily. They also believed that Africa, watching closely, would not allow one nation to stand alone. If this moment feels like a page turning, draw the map in your mind and add one town you believe the world should watch next. Because the next phase of this struggle will not be fought in fields, but in diplomatic halls, trade corridors, and global markets. And that raises the question Washington has tried to avoid. If Burkina Faso can reclaim its seeds, what else might Africa reclaim next? From Washington to Brussels, the $900 million Anti-GMO Seed Law was interpreted not as a local agricultural reform, but as a geopolitical warning shot. In the United States, national security analysts framed the law within a broader pattern. Africa was breaking away from Western-managed food systems at the precise moment America's own agricultural stability was weakening. Internal briefings from the U.S. Department of Agriculture warned that American GMO exports had already suffered from trade tensions with China, Brazil, and India. Losing Africa, the fastest-growing agricultural market on the planet, would accelerate what some described as the Great Decoupling. A senior official privately noted, "If Africa walks away from biotech dependence, we lose a 30-year strategic advantage." The Pentagon also took notice. Africa's shift to indigenous seed systems meant fewer leverage points in future negotiations on aid, security, and regional partnerships. Satellite assessments from AFRICOM highlighted rising agricultural self-sufficiency in the Sahel as a factor that could reduce Western influence in the region. While the public statements were diplomatic, the classified assessments were blunt. Burkina Faso's law was a sovereignty multiplier, weakening the economic and political ties that once kept African states aligned with U.S. policy preferences. In Europe, the reaction was equally tense. France feared the erosion of a long-standing agricultural grip across West Africa. Germany expressed concern that Europe's biotech industry would lose market footholds it considered fundamental to future trade agreements. Brussels began exploring whether the law constituted a barrier to EU-certified agricultural products, signaling a potential WTO flashpoint. Yet outside Western capitals, the Global South read the situation differently. In India, agricultural journals praised Burkina's return to indigenous varieties as a model of decolonized food systems. In Brazil, analysts noted that Africa's pivot might signal the end of biotech-centric global agriculture. Even China quietly monitored the shift, seeing opportunities to expand its own partnerships through seed technology, irrigation strategies, and non-GMO rice hybrids. But it was Africa's internal response that carried the most weight. Nations across the Sahel interpreted Western concern as confirmation that seed sovereignty was not merely symbolic. It touched a nerve embedded deep in global power structures. A Kenyan columnist wrote, "If a seed scares the West, then Africa has found its leverage." As quiet tensions thickened, one question emerged like a thread pulled from a larger pattern. What happens when food independence becomes political independence? If you see the shape of that question forming, name the next honest move you think follows from here. Because the world is beginning to realize that Burkina Faso did not just pass a law, it altered the balance of influence itself. And somewhere in Washington, Brussels, and Beijing, planners are recalculating futures they once assumed were fixed. In the end, the story of Burkina Faso's $900 million Anti-GMO Seed Law is not about crops, budgets, or trade disputes. It is about the return of something the world thought Africa had forgotten, the right to define its own future without permission. For decades, global agriculture ran on an unspoken assumption. Africa would remain dependent on imported seeds, imported chemicals, imported policies, and imported promises. But with one vote, Burkina Faso broke that pattern. And now the consequences are spreading through capitals far beyond Ouagadougou. Western governments fear a precedent they cannot easily reverse, an African nation proving that sovereignty can begin with something as small as a seed. Their concern is not irrational. If Africa can control the foundation of its food system, it can set the terms of trade. If it can set the terms of trade, it can control revenue. If it can control revenue, it can fund its own development. And if it can do that, the old power structures crumble, not from revolt, but from irrelevance. Yet this moment carries a warning too. Pressure will come. Trade disputes will intensify. Aid programs may shift. Diplomatic language will harden, and attempts to divide African nations through incentives, threats, or selective partnerships will almost certainly follow. The next 3 years will test whether Africa can stay united around a shared agricultural vision, or whether external powers will manage to slow the movement before it reaches critical mass. In Burkina Faso, people understand the stakes. They see this moment not as victory, but as responsibility. A farmer in Yako said it plainly: "If we lose our seeds again, we lose everything again." A young engineer in Ouaga added, "We are not fighting the world. We are feeding ourselves." And somewhere in a small Sahel village, a grandmother is teaching her granddaughter how to plant the same seed her own grandmother planted a century ago. That continuity, that quiet thread of memory, may prove stronger than any pressure campaign. But the question remains, will Africa's rise through agriculture become the defining shift of this century? Or will global powers find a way to hold the line? The world is watching, and history is being written in fields, not boardrooms. If this story matters to you, press like and write your city below so your voice becomes part of the record.